Some people don't look like they're about to die. That was the first thing anyone would have said if they saw him that evening. He was standing at the edge of a quiet bridge just outside the city, dressed in a clean, dark suit, his shoes polished, his posture straight. There was nothing about him that suggested desperation, nothing that hinted at what he had already decided. But according to what investigators later noted, he had been there for over 40 minutes, doing nothing but staring down at the slow-moving water beneath him. And not a single person stopped. Not because they didn't care, but because he didn't look like someone who needed saving. What no one knew was that just a few hours earlier, he had signed off on something far more final than any business deal he had ever made. He had already decided that tonight was the end. And strangely, the reason had nothing to do with money, because if money could fix it, he had more than enough. His name was Daniel Adeyemi, and according to business records, he was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. But that wasn't the part people talked about. People talked about how fast he rose, how quiet he was, how he rarely appeared in public unless absolutely necessary, and recently, how he had started disappearing. Board meetings missed, calls unanswered, projects delayed. At first, investors assumed it was strategy. Then they assumed it was stress. But according to someone close to the company, it was neither. Something had happened, something no one inside his world could fully explain. And the strange part was, the only person who came close to changing that outcome was someone completely outside that world. A girl who, by every standard, had even less reason to keep going than he did. Her name was Amina, and that morning she woke up with nothing. No job, no food left in the small wooden container she kept beside her bed, and no clear idea of how she would survive the day. Her home was a small hut at the edge of a quiet village, far from the city where people like Daniel existed. The roof leaked when it rained. The door didn't close properly. And most days, she survived on whatever small help she could find. But according to neighbors, she was never the type to complain, even when things got worse, even when they clearly did. That same morning, she walked nearly an hour to the nearby roadside market, hoping to find any kind of work. Washing plates, carrying goods, anything. But by noon, no one had hired her. By afternoon, she had been turned away more times than she could count. And by evening, she was sitting alone under a small tree, holding the last few coins she had left. Not enough to buy a proper meal, just enough to choose between eating something small or saving it for tomorrow. Most people in that situation would choose to survive the moment. What she did next was something no one around her understood, because instead of going to the food stall nearby, she stood up and walked in the opposite direction, toward the road leading out of the village, and that was where she saw him. At first, he didn't look like anything unusual, just an older man sitting by the roadside, his clothes worn out, his posture weak, his head slightly lowered. To most people passing by, he looked like just another beggar, someone easy to ignore. And to be fair, many already had. But Amina didn't. She slowed down, stopped, and for a few seconds just looked at him, not with pity, not with discomfort, but with a kind of quiet attention that most people rarely give strangers. Then she did something that didn't make sense. She reached into her hand, opened her palm, and dropped her last coins into his. No hesitation, no speech, no expectation, just a simple action from someone who had almost nothing. The man looked up slowly, clearly surprised, not just because she gave him money, but because of how she did it. He studied her face for a moment, as if trying to understand something that didn't add up. And then he asked her a question, a simple one. Why would you give me this when you clearly need yourself? It wasn't an accusation. It was confusion. And her answer was even stranger. She smiled slightly, not a big smile, just enough to soften her tired face. And then she said something that stayed with him longer than she could have ever imagined. Something that, according to later accounts, he would repeat to himself again and again and again. But what she said was not what anyone expected. And it was not the kind of answer that should have mattered. At least not to someone like him. Because at that point, he had already decided how his story would end. He just didn't know yet that this small moment was about to interrupt everything. If you've ever seen someone give when they have nothing, you already know it hits differently. And I want you to stay with this story, because what happens next is not what anyone around them expected. Because after she walked away, he didn't forget her. In fact, that was the problem. He couldn't. She didn't turn back to see his reaction. That was what made it even harder to ignore. Most people, when they give something, especially when it costs them, wait, even if just for a second. They look back. They check if it was appreciated. But Amina didn't. She kept walking as if nothing had happened, as if what she had just done didn't matter. And that was the part that stayed with him. Because to him, everything had always come with a reason. Every deal had a motive. Every partnership had a benefit. Every conversation had a direction. But this had none. And according to what he later told someone close to him, that was the first thing that unsettled him. Not her situation, not her poverty, but her lack of expectation. He sat there for a long time after she left, the coin still resting in his palm. They weren't worth much, but they didn't feel small. Not to him, because for the first time in a long while, something didn't make sense in a way he couldn't control. And he didn't like that. So he stood up, slowly, almost like he had just remembered something. And instead of heading back toward the village, he walked in the same direction she had gone. Not quickly, not urgently, just enough to keep her in sight. He didn't call out to her, didn't try to stop her, but he followed at a distance. And what he saw next only made things worse, because her life didn't improve after that moment. It didn't suddenly get easier. In fact, it became more uncomfortable to watch. She stopped at a small roadside food stall, stood there for a few seconds, looked at the food, and then quietly stepped back, not because she changed her mind, but because she couldn't afford it anymore. He saw it clearly, the hesitation, the brief calculation, the quiet decision to walk away. And for a moment, he thought she might regret what she had done, that she might look back toward him, that she might reconsider, but she didn't. She simply adjusted and kept moving. That was when something shifted in him. Not something big, not something dramatic, just a small discomfort that refused to go away, because now her action had a cost, a real one, and she accepted it without complaint. That didn't fit into anything he understood, so he kept watching. She walked further down the road until she reached a small open space near a broken wooden bench. There were a few children there, playing with worn-out sandals and pieces of plastic. No toys, no supervision, just noise and energy. She sat down quietly at the edge, resting her back slightly. For a moment, she closed her eyes, not in peace, but in exhaustion. And then one of the children noticed her. A small boy, maybe 5 or 6, ran up to her with a wide smile, said something too fast to hear clearly, and she laughed, softly, tired but real. It wasn't forced. It wasn't polite. It was genuine. And that didn't make sense either, because by every visible measure, she had no reason to laugh. No food, no job, no certainty about tomorrow. And yet there she was, laughing, not pretending, actually laughing. The boy sat beside her, talking, pointing at something in the distance. She listened, nodded, responded like she had nowhere else to be. And for the first time since he had seen her, he noticed something that didn't match her situation at all. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't acting like someone at the edge. And that created a second question in his mind, a more uncomfortable one. If she could still sit there and find a moment to smile, then what exactly had he lost that made his own life feel completely empty? He didn't like that question. So he turned away, walked back toward the road, back toward the car that had been waiting for him the entire time. Because yes, he wasn't just some passerby. The car parked a short distance away. Engine off, driver silent, had been there all along, waiting, not asking questions, because people around him had learned not to. When he opened the door and got in, the driver glanced at him briefly through the mirror, noticed something was different, but didn't speak. And for a while, neither did he. They drove in silence, past the market, past the outskirts of the village. back toward the city where everything looked normal. But inside the car, nothing felt settled, because now there were two things in his mind: the decision he had already made, and the moment he couldn't explain. And the two didn't sit well together. According to internal reports from his company, that same evening, he was expected at a high-level dinner meeting. Investors, executives, people who had been trying to reach him for days. But he didn't go. Instead, he gave a different instruction. Short, direct, take me to the bridge. The driver didn't question it, just nodded and changed direction. And as the car moved through the quiet evening traffic, something unusual happened. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the coins she had given him, looked at them again, turned them slightly in his hand, as if trying to understand why they still mattered, because logically they shouldn't. They were insignificant, replaceable, meaningless, but they didn't feel that way. Not anymore. And that was the problem, because earlier that day, everything had been clear, simple, final. But now there was a disruption, a small one, but enough to create hesitation. And hesitation was something he hadn't planned for. By the time they reached the bridge, the sky had already started to darken. The area was quiet, almost empty, the kind of place where no one pays too much attention to strangers. The driver parked at a distance, stayed inside, because that's what he had always done. And Daniel stepped out, walked slowly toward the edge. Same spot as before, same position, same stillness, but not the same state of mind, because this time, he wasn't just looking down at the water, he was thinking, and the more he tried not to, the more that single moment kept returning. Her hand opening, the coins dropping, her voice, that one sentence. Simple, uncomplicated, but impossible to ignore. And what made it worse was that he still didn't fully understand it. Why would someone with nothing act like they had enough? Why would someone struggling still choose to give? And more importantly, what did she see? That he couldn't anymore? The water below moved slowly, quiet, unbothered, and for a moment, he leaned forward slightly, just enough, not enough to fall, but enough to feel the distance between where he stood and where he could be in seconds. This was the point, the exact moment he had already planned. No interruptions, no second chances, no complications, just a decision carried out. But something wasn't aligning, because instead of silence inside his head, there was noise, not loud, but persistent. Her voice, her face, that strange calmness. And then something even more unexpected happened. Footsteps, soft, uneven, coming from behind him. At first, he ignored it, assumed it was just someone passing by. But the steps didn't pass. They slowed, stopped, and then a voice, familiar, closer than it should have been. Why do people always come here when they're tired? He froze, not because of the question, but because of who asked it, because somehow, against all logic, against all distance, she was there, right behind him. And she wasn't supposed to be, not here, not now, and definitely not at this exact moment. He didn't turn immediately. For a second, he just stood there, his hands resting lightly on the cold metal railing, his eyes still fixed on the water below, because his mind was trying to catch up with something that didn't make sense. That voice, it wasn't possible. He had left her miles away, different road, different direction, different world entirely. And yet, there was no mistake. Slowly, he straightened, turned just enough to confirm what he already knew. It was her. Amina stood a few steps behind him, her breathing slightly uneven, as if she had walked a long distance without rest. Her clothes were the same. Her face carried the same quiet calm. But now there was something else. Not urgency, not panic, just awareness, as if she understood more than she was saying. He frowned slightly, not out of anger, but confusion. "How did you get here?" he asked. His voice was controlled, but not as steady as before. She shrugged lightly. "I followed the road." Simple answer. No explanation. No attempt to impress. And somehow, that made it harder to process, because people in his world always explained themselves. They justified. They expanded. They made sure they were understood. But she didn't. She stepped a little closer, stopping at a safe distance beside him. Not too near, not too far. And then she looked over the railing, down at the same water he had been staring at. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, but it wasn't comfortable either. It felt unfinished, like something was waiting to be said. And then she spoke again. "You didn't answer my question." He exhaled slowly. "I didn't think it needed an answer." She nodded slightly, as if she expected that. "People don't come here for no reason," she said quietly. "Not at this time." He looked at her properly now, trying to understand what she was doing. Was she guessing? Was she assuming? Or did she actually know? "You're making a lot of conclusions," he replied. "I'm observing," she said. That answer lingered longer than it should have, because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't confrontational. It was just direct. And for some reason, that made it harder to dismiss. He turned back toward the water. "You should go home," he said. "It's late." She didn't move. "I will," she said. "But not yet." A pause. Then she added more softly, "Not if you're planning to stay here like this." That was the first moment the tension shifted. Before now, everything had been internal. His thoughts, his decision, his silence. But now it had been spoken. Not directly, not dramatically, but clearly enough. And once something like that is said out loud, it becomes harder to ignore. He let out a short breath. "You don't know anything about me." "That's true," she said. No argument, no pushback, just agreement. And then, "But I don't think I need to." That made him look at her again, because that kind of statement usually came with arrogance. But she didn't sound arrogant. She sounded certain. And that was different. "What do you think you see?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied him for a moment. Not his clothes, not his posture, but his face, like she was trying to read something deeper. Then she said, "I think you're tired." He almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was incomplete. "Everyone is tired," he said. She shook her head slightly. "No, not like this." Another pause. "You're not just tired of work," she continued. "You're tired of everything." That landed, not loudly, not dramatically, but directly. And for a second, he didn't respond, because she wasn't entirely wrong. But she also wasn't entirely right. And that space in between was uncomfortable. "You're guessing," he said finally. "Maybe," she replied. Then she leaned lightly against a railing, her eyes still on the water. "But I've seen that look before." That caught his attention. "In who?" he asked. She hesitated, just briefly, then answered, "My father." The tone changed. Subtle, but noticeable. Not heavier, just more grounded. "He used to sit outside our house like this," she continued. "Quiet, not talking to anyone, just staring." He said nothing. She didn't rush. "He wasn't always like that," she added. "He used to laugh a lot, talk to everyone, make plans." A small pause. Then one day he stopped. The air felt different now. Not tense, but focused, as if the conversation had shifted into something more real. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked. She didn't answer immediately, and that delay created its own kind of tension, because now it wasn't just about him anymore. Now there was another story inside this one, and he didn't know where it was going. "He got tired," she said finally. Simple, but not complete. And that incompleteness made it heavier. "Tired of what?" he pressed. She looked at him briefly, then back at the water. "Trying," she said. That word stayed there, unmoved, because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't detailed, but it was enough. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The night air moved slightly around them. The distant sound of a passing car faded quickly. Everything else felt still. And then he asked a question he didn't expect himself to ask. What did he do? Her fingers tightened slightly against the railing, not visibly enough for most people to notice, but enough. "He left," she said. Another pause. Then more quietly, "Not the house." Now, he was listening fully, because the meaning was clear. but she still hadn't said it directly, and that made it harder to look away. He came to a place like this, she continued. Not this exact bridge, but somewhere similar. A breath. He thought no one would notice. Daniel's grip on the railing tightened slightly, not consciously, but enough to ground him. And did someone notice? He asked. She nodded. Yes. Who? She looked at him again. This time, her expression didn't change, but her answer did something else entirely. I did. That shifted everything, because now, the story wasn't distant anymore. It wasn't about someone else in a vague way. It was personal, immediate, and unfinished. And for the first time since she arrived, he wasn't thinking about leaving, but he also wasn't thinking clearly anymore, because something about this conversation was starting to interfere with the decision he had already made, and that wasn't part of the plan. He didn't ask the next question immediately, not because he didn't want it, but because he already knew what it would be, and he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Still, after a few seconds, it came out anyway. What happened when you got there? Amina didn't look at him this time. Her eyes stayed on the water, her voice steady, almost as if she had told herself this story many times before, just not to someone like him. I talked, she said. A short pause. He didn't listen. That felt familiar, too familiar. And then Daniel asked quietly. She exhaled softly. I stayed. That word carried more weight than the others. Not loud, not emotional, just firm. I didn't leave him alone, she added, even when he told me to go. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, because that, too, felt familiar. The pushing people away, the wanting silence, the belief that being alone made things easier. What made him stop? He asked. This time, her answer didn't come quickly, and that delay stretched a moment, because now, for the first time, there was uncertainty. And that uncertainty created a new question. Did he stop, or did something else happen? Finally, she spoke. He didn't stop because of something I said. That wasn't what he expected. He stopped because I refused to leave. Daniel looked at her again, fully this time, because that answer didn't follow the usual pattern. People expect the right words to fix things, the perfect sentence, the exact emotional trigger. But she was saying something else, that sometimes it wasn't about words at all. How long did you stay? He asked. She gave a small shrug. I don't know. It felt long. Then she added, but it worked. A brief silence followed, and then, almost without thinking, he asked a question that had been forming since she started speaking. Where is he now? Amina didn't answer immediately, and that was the moment everything slowed down, because now there were only two possible directions, and neither of them felt light. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't change, but something underneath it did. He's gone, she said. The words landed quietly. No dramatics, no explanation, just the truth in its simplest form. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not sharply, but enough. Gone, he repeated. She nodded once. Yes. Another pause. Then she added carefully, but not that day. That mattered more than he expected, because it meant something important. It meant that moment, that night, had not been the end. Something had changed, even if it didn't last forever. He stayed, she continued, for a while after that. Daniel didn't interrupt. She made him stay. A small voice inside him tried to conclude, but she didn't say it that way. She didn't take credit. She didn't frame it like a victory. She simply told it as it was. He started talking again, she said. Not immediately, but slowly. Her fingers rested lightly on the railing now. Relaxed. He even laughed sometimes. A faint, almost invisible smile touched her lips for a second, then faded. And then one day he got sick. The air shifted again, subtly, but this time it wasn't because he was tired, she added. Daniel didn't need to ask. He understood. Some things are outside control. Some endings come anyway, but he didn't leave like before, she said. Now she looked at him, directly. He stayed long enough to say goodbye. That was the part that held everything together. Not a miracle ending, not a perfect save, but something quieter, something more real. And somehow that made it heavier, because now the question changed. It wasn't just about stopping the moment. It was about what comes after, and whether that time matters. Daniel turned back toward the water, but he wasn't seeing it the same way anymore, because earlier, everything had felt final, clean, simple. Now it felt interrupted, complicated, unfinished. "You think that's enough?" he asked after a while. She tilted her head slightly. "Enough for what?" "To stay," he said. "To keep going." Amina didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't know, but because she understood the weight of the question. And rushed answers don't help in moments like this. Finally, she spoke. "I don't think it has to be enough forever." That made him look at her again. "Just for now," she added. That answer did something unexpected. It reduced the scale, took something overwhelming and made it smaller, more manageable, because forever is heavy, but now is something you can hold. "You don't have to solve everything today," she continued. "You just have to not end it today." That landed differently, not like advice, not like pressure, but like permission. And for the first time since he arrived at the bridge, the idea of stepping back didn't feel like failure. It felt like a delay, a pause, and that was easier to accept. But still, something inside him resisted, because decisions like this don't disappear easily. "They won't understand," he said suddenly. The words came out before he could stop them. Amina didn't ask who they were. She didn't need to. "Maybe," she said. That wasn't comforting, but it was honest. "And maybe you don't need them to right now." Another shift, because now the focus moved again, away from expectations, back to the moment, back to him. "You said earlier," she continued slowly, "that I don't know anything about you." He didn't respond. "That's true," she said again. "I don't know your life." A small pause. "But I know what it looks like when someone is about to disappear." That word again. Disappear. Not die. Not end. Disappear. And somehow that made it feel more real, more human, more preventable. She pushed herself gently away from the railing, turned slightly toward him. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said. "You don't even have to explain anything." Another step closer. "But you shouldn't do this alone." That was the closest she had come to saying it directly. Not dramatic, not loud, but clear. And now, there was no space left to pretend. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her tired face, her worn clothes, her empty hands. And somehow, she was the one standing steady, while he wasn't. That didn't make sense. And yet, it was true. He looked back at the water one last time. The same water that had felt like an ending just minutes ago, but now it didn't feel the same. Not completely, because something had changed. Not everything, but enough. His fingers slowly loosened from the railing, just slightly, not fully, not decisively, but enough to create space. A small gap between him and the edge, and that gap mattered. But the moment wasn't over, because decisions like this don't resolve in a single breath. They shift, they hesitate, they return. And just as that thought passed through his mind, something else happened. A sound, sharp, unexpected. From behind them, a car door slamming, followed by hurried footsteps. Not calm like before, not slow, urgent, and then a voice, louder than it should have been in a place this quiet. "Sir." Daniel's expression changed instantly. Not fear, not surprise, but recognition, because that voice belonged to someone from the world he had been trying to leave behind. And they weren't supposed to find him here. Not tonight. Not now. Amina glanced in the same direction, her brows pulling together slightly, because whoever was coming was about to bring something with them. Something that didn't belong to this quiet moment. Something that could either pull him back or push him further. And the way Daniel straightened slightly told her one thing clearly. This wasn't over yet. The footsteps came fast. Too fast for a place that had been quiet just seconds ago. Daniel didn't turn immediately, but his posture changed. The stillness he had been holding onto broke. "Sir." The voice came again, closer now, urgent, controlled, familiar. Amina stepped slightly back, her eyes moving between Daniel and the approaching figure, trying to understand what was happening without asking. A man in a dark suit reached them, slightly out of breath, stopping a few steps away as if unsure how close he should get. "Sir, we've been looking everywhere for you," he said, lowering his voice quickly when he noticed Amina. Daniel finally turned. His expression didn't show anger, but it wasn't calm either. "How did you find me?" he asked. The man hesitated for a second. "The driver informed security when you didn't respond," he said. "We traced the route." A brief pause. "You're needed back at the house. There's been an update." That word didn't sit right. "Not here. Not now." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "What update?" The man glanced briefly at Amina again, then back at Daniel. "It's about the hospital," he said carefully. That was enough. Something shifted instantly, not on the surface, but deeper, because whatever had been pulling Daniel toward the edge was connected to that one word, hospital. Amina noticed it, the way his shoulders tightened, the way his focus changed. And just like that, another piece of the story opened. "You should go," she said quietly, not as a dismissal, not as distance, but as understanding. Because whatever that was, it mattered. Daniel didn't move. Not yet, because now there were two directions again. One that pulled him back into everything he had been trying to escape, and one that kept him here, in this moment that had already begun to change something in him. "They've been trying to reach you for hours," the man added. "The doctors said it's important." Doctors. Important. Words like that don't come without weight. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then, almost without thinking, he spoke. "How much time?" The man blinked, slightly confused. "Sir, how much time do I have before I need to be there?" Daniel clarified. The question itself was new, because earlier, he hadn't been planning for time at all. The man checked his watch quickly. "If we leave now, we can get there in 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Amina watched him carefully, because she understood something he hadn't said yet. He was calculating, not about business, not about money, but about whether he still had a reason to go. And that question was more important than anything else happening around them. "Sir," the man said more softly now, "she asked for you." That changed everything. Daniel froze for a second, not visibly, but enough, because now it wasn't just obligation. It wasn't just responsibility. It was personal. Amina didn't ask who she was. She didn't need to. The answer was already there in the silence that followed. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, just a second, but in that second, something finally connected. Because all this time, it hadn't been about money. It hadn't been about pressure. It hadn't been about failure. It had been about loss. Or more precisely, the fear of it. When he opened his eyes again, they were clearer. Not fixed, not completely steady, but clearer than before. And for the first time since he arrived at that bridge, he took a step back. Not a big one, not dramatic, just enough to move away from the edge. And that small movement was a decision, not the full answer, not the complete change, but the interruption, the delay, the not today. He turned to Amina, looked at her properly, as if trying to memorize something. Not her face exactly, but the moment. "You followed the road," he said quietly. She nodded. "You should probably go home," he added. There was no distance in his voice now, no dismissal, just acknowledgement. She gave a small nod. "I will." A brief pause. Then she added, "You should too." It was simple, but it landed, because for the first time, home didn't sound like a place he wanted to avoid. Daniel turned to the man beside him. "Let's go," he said. No hesitation this time. They started walking back toward the car, but after a few steps, he stopped, turned back. Amina was already stepping away, heading in the opposite direction, same as before. No expectation, no waiting, just moving forward. "Amina!" He called her name without thinking. She turned, slightly surprised. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the coin she had given him earlier, walked back a few steps toward her, held them out. She looked at them, then at him, and for a second, neither of them spoke. "You might need these more than I do," he said. It made sense, logically, but something about it felt incomplete. Amina smiled slightly, the same quiet smile as before. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. A small pause. "Keep them." He frowned slightly. "Why?" Her answer came without delay. "So, you remember?" That was it. No long explanation. No added meaning. Just those two words. And somehow, they carried more weight than everything else. He looked at the coins again, then closed his hand around them, slowly, as if sealing something. When he looked up again, she had already started walking, not rushing, not looking back, just continuing like she always had. Daniel stood there for a second longer, then turned and walked back to the car. According to later reports, Daniel Adeyemi arrived at the hospital that night just in time. The details of what happened inside were never fully made public, but what is known is this: he didn't return to the bridge. Not that night, not after, and in the weeks that followed, something about him changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines, but in smaller ways, consistent ways. He started showing up again, not just to meetings, but to conversations, to people, to moments he would have ignored before. And according to someone close to him, there was one thing he never let go of: a small set of coins he kept with him, not because of their value, but because of what they represented. A pause, a delay, a second that became another day, and another, and another. As for Amina, her life didn't suddenly transform overnight. There was no miracle shift, no instant rescue. She still woke up the next morning in the same small hut, still faced the same uncertainty. But something had changed, not around her, but within the path ahead of her. Because a few days later, someone came looking for her, not loudly, not publicly, but intentionally. And when they found her, they didn't come with charity. They came with opportunity, work, stability, a way forward. No announcements, no grand gestures, just a quiet door opening where there had been none before. And even then, she didn't know the full story. Not immediately, not completely. Because some connections don't need to be explained to exist. Some moments don't need recognition to matter. And that night on the bridge was one of them. Because sometimes it's not about fixing everything. It's not about having all the answers. It's not even about knowing what comes next. Sometimes it's just about being there long enough to interrupt the ending. If you ever had a moment where something small changed everything, then you already understand this story better than most. And if this meant something to you, you can share it with someone who might need it too, because you never really know who is standing at their own edge, waiting for a reason to step back